In front of me is a pile of ancient graphics cards released nearly 18 years ago. The weakest one here has just 512 megabytes of VRAM, while the most powerful one used to cost almost $2,000 when it first launched. And now, some of these are so weak people joke that they're basically integrated graphics with an HDMI port. The funny part is, you can still buy them today, but instead of playing old games on them, I'm going to do something completely unreasonable. I'm forcing these ancient GPU to run Minecraft with shaders, and to make things even worse, I'll be overclocking them, stress testing them, and pushing them far beyond what they were designed for. That still doesn't feel painful enough. So to deal the final blow, I'm going to spawn thousands of TNT at the same time, just to see which one survives, and which one finally gives up. Starting with the GT710, released back in 2016. This thing is the definition of a display-only GPU. Even 1080p is enough to make it struggle. Compared to modern graphics cards, it's around 60 times weaker. So yeah, this is probably going to be an absolute disaster, but if we really want to understand how terrible this card is, there's only one thing left to do. Let's torture this thing immediately. I don't even know if this thing still works. And oh my god, it boots. This card is alive, with just 1 gigabyte of VRAM and painfully slow DDR3 memory. Alright, let's see what kind of FPS it can actually push. 63 FPS at first, but after the map finishes loading, it drops to around 35. And the GPU is already pinned at 100% usage, fighting for its life. After dropping the chunks to the absolute minimum, it actually hits 143 FPS. But now comes the real question. Is it weaker than integrated graphics? And I'm not joking. This is the FPS from the iGPU inside a 4th gen Intel CPU. It actually gets more FPS than this card. The only real advantage of the GT710 is temperature. It stays surprisingly cool even with passive cooling. But what about shaders? Oh man, this is brutal. The GPU is screaming under all those lighting and shadow effects. It only gets 9 FPS. So I tried overclocking it as far as I could. First I added 100 MHz. FPS went from 9 to 11. Not enough. So I pushed another 100 MHz, and it gained 1 more frame. At that point, I realized I could probably add another 500 MHz and still barely get anything useful. So yeah, I stopped right there. Now for the final test. Can this card survive 10,000 TNT blocks? I started with 10 blocks first, and somehow it handled that perfectly. No big drops, no drama. Then I moved to 1000 TNT. Let's see if it crashes. And weirdly enough, still no major drop, probably because the CPU is doing most of the heavy lifting here. So now, 10,000 TNT. And there it is. The frame rate completely collapses down to 1 FPS. This is the limit. I'm surprised it didn't crash. So final verdict, yes, the GT710 can technically run Minecraft with shaders, as long as you don't care about FPS, comfort, or your own eyesight. The next graphics card is the AMD FirePro W2100, originally released back in 2014. And somehow, even after all these years, the plastic wrap on it still hasn't been peeled off yet, which is honestly kind of insane. Compared to the previous card, this thing has way more processing power, more cores, and even double the VRAM. But the weirdest part? It actually costs only about half the price of the GT710. So now I'm genuinely curious. Is this old AMD card secretly faster? Or is it just another disaster waiting to happen? Alright then, let's throw it into Minecraft and find out. At the lowest chunk setting, this card pushes around 290 FPS. That's almost double the first card. That's insane. For a GPU that costs around $10, I did not expect this at all. But now comes the real question. Can it handle shaders? Oh my god. 12 FPS. Yeah, that's still terrible. But compared to the previous card, it's technically a little better, around 2 to 3 FPS higher. Not impressive, but still an improvement. The bad news is I couldn't overclock this card. I'm not exactly sure why. But the good news? It runs pretty quietly. Now let's see if it can survive 10,000 TNT blocks. Boom! 1 FPS, but somehow it still holds on, and the FPS recovers pretty quickly. So overall, this card is definitely better than the first one. And somehow it's even cheaper. Now it's time for GPU number 3, the GT645 OEM. This thing is basically a disguised GTX 560 SE. It definitely wasn't built for modern gaming, especially with only 1.5 gigabytes of RAM. But unlike the previous cards, this one actually uses GDDR5 memory, which is a huge upgrade in bandwidth. The funny part is, despite being this weak on paper, it still consumes a ridiculous amount of power, and even needs dual 6-pin connectors just to run. So theoretically, if it's pulling this much electricity, it should be more powerful, right? Well, let's find out if all that power draw actually means anything in real gameplay. This is actually insane. The FPS shot all the way past 600 on version 1.20. Completely different compared to all the previous GPU, and the craziest part is, this card is ancient. At this point, I started wondering if I could push this thing all the way to 1000 FPS. So, after about 5 minutes of aggressively destroying every setting imaginable, I finally did it. But now comes the real question. How many FPs can it get with shaders? I was hoping for at least 60. Reality hit me straight in the face with 25 FPS. So naturally, I started overclocking it like a maniac. I pushed the core clock all the way up to 2300 MHz, and the card immediately started having a nervous breakdown. Artifacts everywhere, screen glitches, pure chaos. So I backed it down to 2200 MHz, and thankfully it became stable again. But the reward for risking the life of the GPU? An extra 5 FPS. Truly life-changing technology right there. At that point, I gave up on brute force and lowered the resolution down to HD instead, and suddenly performance jumped to around 50 FPS. Then in windowed mode, it actually went above 70. So surprisingly, the GT645 OEM is actually pretty decent. Now let's compare it to this GT610. Even though both cards belong to the GeForce 600 series, the performance gap between them is absolutely massive. The GT610 uses the weakest Fermi chip possible, with only 48 UDA cores. That's roughly 6 times fewer than the GT645 OEM. And inside, just 1 GB of VRAM. This thing was never meant for gaming. It barely feels meant for existing. But alright, let's see how much suffering this little card can survive. But then something really strange happened. This card refused to display any image at all. I tried different video outputs, still nothing. At first I thought the card was simply too old and modern hardware just didn't want to deal with it anymore. So I moved it into an older system instead, and finally it came back to life. Now for the benchmark. It only managed around 115 FPS, which is somehow worse than the GT710. And on top of that, this thing runs unbelievably hot, over 70 degrees Celsius already. I'm pretty sure the passive cooler is the main reason for that. Alright, time for shaders. Oh no, this thing is terrifyingly slow, 4 FPS. At this point, the temperature climbed all the way to 80 degrees Celsius, and the heatsink got so hot I almost burned my hand touching it. So naturally, I lowered the room AC down to 18 degrees and zip-tied a fan directly onto the GPU like some desperate engineer in a garage. And the result? Pretty disappointing. Temperatures only dropped by around 6 or 7 degrees. Then I overclocked it another 100 MHz and gained exactly 2 extra FPS. Truly revolutionary performance gains. The moment I tried pushing it further, the system immediately rewarded me with a beautiful blue screen. Very encouraging. Surprisingly though, when I tested TNT explosions, the card didn't crash at all. It actually survived pretty well. Although if I tried 1000 TNT blocks, I'm pretty sure the GPU would achieve nuclear fusion. So overall, yes, it can run shaders, but it does it in the most painful way possible. The fifth card is the AMD HD 7750, and compared to the GT610, this thing is around 4 times stronger. So, on paper, the specs actually don't look that bad. It has 512 stream processors and was designed as a budget-friendly card for systems with weak power supplies. The best part? It doesn't need any external power connector, and it uses very little electricity. Let's jump straight in and see what kind of performance it can deliver. And this is where things started going wrong. At first, everything looked completely normal, but the moment I launched a game, instant crash. And somehow it got even worse. Anytime I opened software to monitor hardware performance, the system would immediately crash again in the exact same way. At this point, I started suspecting the drivers were either corrupted or just way too old. So I tried reinstalling a newer version. Unfortunately, nothing changed. Same crashes, same instability, which probably means this card didn't survive our little experiment after all. Let's welcome the GTX 560. It was released back in 2011. I'm pretty impressed by the way it looks. The design is completely different compared to the other cards here. It actually looks more like a real gaming GPU. Back around 15 years ago, this was a very solid mid-range graphics card. I already tested it in CS2 and it actually ran pretty well. So I'm pretty confident it can handle Minecraft without much trouble. The only thing I'm not sure about yet is how well it handles shaders. Just like I expected, this thing absolutely flies in-game. FPS instantly jumps to around 600 and sometimes even touches 700. And unlike the previous cards, the GPU isn't even being fully utilized. This benchmark is way too easy for it. So let's move straight to shaders. And interestingly, the performance actually isn't that much different from the GT645 OEM at first. But after the map finishes loading, this card slowly pulls ahead. FPS stabilizes around 32, while temperatures stay near 67 degrees Celsius. At that point, I started wondering, can I squeeze out a few more frames with overclocking? So I added another 100 MHz, and suddenly the FPS jumped to 41. But then I noticed something terrifying. A weird flickering effect started appearing on the screen. I really hoped it wasn't caused by the overclock, and then the GPU immediately crashed out of the game. So overall, yeah, it can run shaders, but only at a very limited frame rate before things start falling apart. Now, moving on to GPU number 7, the Quadro FX 4800. And this thing is easily the monster of today's lineup. Released back in 2008, this card originally launched at nearly $2,000. I actually tested it a few weeks ago, so I went into this expecting it to dominate shaders. Although, there is one tiny problem. It still only has 1.5 gigabytes of VRAM. In normal gameplay, it reaches just over 300 FPS, which is somehow only about half of what the GTX 560 managed. Alright then, time for shaders. And wow, this is not what I expected. Performance is absolutely terrible, only around 12 FPS. And on top of that, the temperatures are insanely hot. You can literally hear the cooler screaming like a jet engine trying to take off. The worst moment is when I look down at the water. The FPS completely collapses to around 3 frames per second. After overclocking, I managed to gain around 4 extra FPS, which honestly still doesn't save it. Now let's see what happens if I explode 1000 TNT blocks. And surprisingly, it actually holds up really well. Frame drops are much smaller compared to the previous GPU, and the game remains strangely stable, which honestly makes sense since this is a workstation card after all. Then I switched the game into windowed mode, and somehow the FPS jumped all the way up to around 45, which is technically smooth, assuming your eyes are emotionally prepared for it. And finally, the GPU I wanted to test the least, the legendary GT210. This thing is unbelievably terrible. I honestly don't even need to explain much about it. For blind people, this card is basically a miracle, because the only thing it does well is display an image. It originally launched back in 2008, and somehow its performance is actually weaker than some second-generation Intel integrated graphics. So yeah, the specs really don't matter here. The suffering is already guaranteed. Jumping into the game with the absolute lowest settings possible, the card manages around 37 FPS while walking around on the ground, and the GPU is already at 100% usage, fighting for its life. Technically, it's playable, but definitely not smooth. And remember, this is already the lowest possible setting, so I wanted something closer to a real playable experience, maybe around 60 FPS. I lowered the resolution down to HD, and somehow it completely shocked me. The game suddenly jumped to over 90 FPS, which honestly feels illegal for a GT210, but now it's time to truly torture this thing. Shaders, and what the actual hell? The game becomes a slideshow immediately, even in the menu. 2 FPS. It genuinely looks less like Minecraft and more like a broken PowerPoint presentation. So naturally, I tried overclocking it, and immediately, artifacting started appearing all over the screen. At this point, the VRAM is probably begging for mercy, and honestly, the overclock barely improves anything anyway. So final verdict, no! The GT210 absolutely cannot run Minecraft shaders, and the final card is the Radeon HD 7450, released back in 2012. Just by looking at it, you can already tell this thing was never designed for gaming. It has this tiny little fan that honestly looks terrified of doing any actual work. I genuinely don't know if it can even cool the card properly under full load. So if you're searching for a gaming GPU, stay far away from this thing. But then something completely unexpected happened. Its performance was actually more than 3 times faster than that terrible GT210. At full HD, the game hovered around 120 FPS, which honestly shocked me. Alright then, time to traumatize it with shaders? Boom. 4 FPS. Absolutely awful. But somehow, still better than the previous card. And then, oh no, it crashed. completely crashed before I even got the chance to overclock it. So yeah, this card definitely cannot handle shaders either. Alright, I think this is where I finally stopped torturing old GPU. Thanks for watching the video.